So we've got a panel discussion which features leaders of the four task forces that we are working to implement, which are at the recommendation of Together North Jersey Regional Plan. So each member of the panel is going to deliver brief opening remarks, and they know they've got 5 minutes. And so my very warm, with the greatest respect, comment to the panel will be is that at 4 minutes I'm going to wave at you, and at 5 minutes I'm going to jump in front of you, okay? Because we're going to keep this rolling along there. But they know this in advance, and each of them will deal with their element in a very short period. And the reason that we want to do that, again, we're going to deal with competitive, efficient, livable, and resilient regions. We've only got an hour to work on this, okay? And the reality of it is that the real important part of this is you interacting with them. And so the reason that they've got 5 minutes is to give you sort of an overview. My challenge to all of you is that when we get to the question portion of it, if you don't ask questions, I will. So it's imperative upon all of you to make sure that you get the most out of this, and that includes all of you over here. So don't be afraid to stick your hand in here. You're closer to me, so grab it. Right? But the bottom line is, when you get to your questions, please do me a favor. Be succinct. Be very direct about what you want. Let's try to get as many in as we possibly can in the time allotment we've got. Folks, when you go to answer, stay on topic, the whole thing. So we make this as interactive as we possibly can. I go back to it. You don't ask questions, I got a list of them here, but it's probably not what you want to know. Let's make sure that you all are getting out of this what you want. So I want to introduce our panelists. I want to get started. You can all read about the amazing credentials that they all have in their book. First speaker is right on the end there. It's a gentleman by the name of Mike Kerwin. He is the president and CEO of the Somerset County Business Partnership. He is the co-chair of Together North Jersey's competitive task force. He's a great friend and a great ally in Somerset County, and he is going to be speaking about what it means for our region to be competitive. Mike, you are up, and the clock is ticking, buddy.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank NJTPA for hosting this event and for the great turnout. I really appreciate the comments made by our keynote, because they echoed kind of the what we call the theory of the business we work under in Somerset County, which is basically the world changed in 2009, and we witnessed startling economic and demographic changes that reversed 50-year trends. So it's very, very important that we understand what is happening, and I think Matt echoed some of those that are happening in Hunterdon. The same thing goes for Somerset. But getting people to understand these changes has been a challenge, but I think we've made a lot of progress. We also, I think, can collectively agree in this room, one of the key things that our keynote said, which is those regions that strategically respond will have a competitive advantage. Those regions that just want to muddle through will be left behind. So Pittsburgh strategically responded, the Research Triangle strategically responded, North Jersey can strategically respond as well. So the question is, how do we do that? Let me share you an approach that we've been doing in Somerset County. I think that makes sense, and that would be a good model. And I got to commend Peter Palmer, Freeholder, and the Freeholders for instituting this as a series of policies that we made to respond to the new normal and answer the question what we could do to strategically respond starting in Somerset County. First of all, they did a bottoms-up approach. This was an invention of my colleague Walt Lane and the Somerset County Planning Board that reached out to every municipality and said, this is where we have identified areas of potential redevelopment and growth, and we're willing to support that. If the municipality said we don't want it, we said fine, and we moved on. We have better things to do than argue with municipalities over whether or not they're with the program or not. We educate them, and if they still don't want to support it, then we identify those areas that are suitable candidates. And as a result, we in Somerset County have a map that shows where priority growth investment will take place. Then the county moved forward and said, we will now help municipalities make those places great. They don't say it like that. They call it a priority growth investment area, but they're planners, right? So we called learning, helping the municipalities make these communities great, make these places great. And then the next step of the process was to partner with the private sector. We got a federal grant to do a SEDS. What is a SEDS? A comprehensive economic development strategy that allows you to answer the following question. What does the private sector need in your community to drive job creation and private sector investment? That's what a SEDS answers. So we can now know what the Somerset County business community needs for job creation and private sector investment because we did a SEDS. And we aligned those strategies with the priority growth investment area. And then we did a couple other things. We pretended that the state adopted its state strategic plan because it made a lot of sense. Because we liked the state strategic plan and we liked the goals of the state strategic plan. So we put our plans in alignment with that. And then it culminated, of course, with the North Jersey Transportation Planning Association, Together North Jersey. Think about the goals of our economic competitiveness and ask yourself the question, are these achievable goals? I submit they are. But are they achievable if we act independently? I think we have to address these as a region. Well-paying jobs, infrastructure investment, attracting business, innovation, and I would echo the need to partner closely with our universities, something that New Jersey was behind, but we're catching up on that, and align workforce with industry needs. So let me close with a brief point on transportation. Let's look at transportation investment. We know there's going to be a revolution in transportation based on that technology. Rather than looking at level of service and condition of roads, we can still ask those questions. Ask the question, what do we need to do to make our economy competitive, drive jobs and investment, or lead to a boom in our economy? And we'll take it there.
Mike, thank you so very, very much. We appreciate it. And I want to echo something you just said very quickly. Education is critical. And you heard me say it a little bit before. If we don't educate what the needs are and how to go about doing it and why it's there, we're never going to change that culture, and we've got to change that culture. So, Mike, thank you very much. You'll be able to ask Mike questions specifically in a couple of minutes. We're going to move on to the subject of efficiency and what it means to be an efficient region. And to speak to that, I want you to welcome Courtney Mercer of the Mercer Planning Associates and the co-chair of the Together North Jersey Efficient Task Force. So take it away, Courtney.
Great. I'm going to be very efficient using my clock there. And by the way, any of you who know me, I think it's apt that I'm co-chair Efficient, along with Ann Brady of Plant Smart, because I am very efficient. Some people might call me OCD. So the mission of the Efficient Task Force is really for communities to make wise use of existing infrastructure and natural resources. So growth shouldn't encroach upon sensitive areas or excessively burden services. This sounds a little familiar for those of you who remember a little ditty called the State Plan. It's basically something we've been preaching for decades. Luckily, the market, with its walking, biking, and transit riding baby boomers and millennials, is finally catching up to this concept. We have some of the oldest communities and some of the oldest industrial areas in the nation. We have great access to jobs, which makes us apt for redevelopment. We need funding and policy to support this redevelopment. The EDA, New Jersey EDA, is doing a great job of supporting developers and businesses on their specific projects, but I think we need to start thinking more holistically. You know, it's one thing to say we should make use of existing infrastructure, but then inadequately fund that infrastructure. Developers come because it's there, but neither the developers nor the government are doing much to ensure that that infrastructure keeps up with the demand. You know, we have crumbling water infrastructure. We've all heard the stories about the wooden pipes in Newark that are leaking Highlands water like a sieve. And we have stormwater systems with CSOs that can't keep up with regular demand. Forget the impacts of climate change and the millions of dollars of damage coming along with that. Trains, tunnels, bridges that are beyond capacity and beyond useful life. We're insufficiently implementing safety mechanisms, as we unfortunately found out in Hoboken, but also in Long Island and Philadelphia. It's not just us. You know, we need to start implementing the innovative funding practices that we as a region have studied and talked about for a long time. Mechanisms that other parts of the U.S. are using and other countries are using with great success. Value capture, P3s. You know, London has had, until its latest decision with Brexit, had booming property values, and they took advantage of those booming property values to fund their infrastructure. Look at, and I will use Jersey City as an example a lot because I live there and I happen to have done some work there, so I know it very well. But just look at the booming property values, look at the buildings going up there. We're not capturing any of that value. The value that they're getting for the fact that they have the infrastructure, and there's no reciprocity there. We also have to stop planning and governing in silos. Water doesn't stop flowing at your municipal border. Your goods cross states, even oceans before it gets to your home. Between DOT-run roads, New Jersey Transit trains, Port Authority transit, tunnels and bridges, and then the New York City Metro, the typical New York commuter into New York City is using multiple systems, all run by different governing entities, each claiming to collaborate, but that's neither seen nor felt by the weary commuter. We're a metropolitan region that's interconnected in so many ways. Our public officials need to face this, and it's not just northern New Jersey, it's northern New Jersey with New York, southern New Jersey with Philly. The success of your neighbor, and I love that Mitch pointed this out and Freeholder pointed it out, the success of your neighbor is your success. Let's stop competing with one another and start working together to meet the needs of all of our residents. So I have a minute, so I just want to hit a little bit on the sharing economy and technology. It's really critical for an efficient community. It's both kind of an asset and a threat. So, many people are opting not to own cars because of sharing services like Zipcar and Uber. But would that person without the car have otherwise taken transit but for access to Zipcar? And how efficient is it for the Uber driver to come to a fare rather than grabbing the taxi that's already en route? We've got co-working space and telecommuting, which are less transit intensive, travel intensive, and reduce the need for office space. And depending on who you are, that might be a good or bad thing. But are we keeping up with the technological infrastructure needs to meet those new workspaces, particularly with internet and fiber? Electric vehicles, we need the infrastructure to support this, to charge them. They're probably most useful in cities, but the hardest place to address this. In Jersey City, I have walked over cords going across the sidewalk because there's not a place for these people to plug in their cars. The Efficient Task Force is actually, I'm going over, looking into this, and so we're going to help with ordinances. And one last thing I just want to mention, self-driving cars. This is probably going to be the biggest concern. Where is this going to go? Right. Yes, they'll drive more efficient routes in less time, causing more fuel consumption per ride, but will this create a new auto boom because of that very efficiency? Would they rather get in the cars than the transit that only has one route and then ultimately have more vehicle miles traveled? We have to start thinking about the policy and infrastructure implications of this sharing economy and these new technologies.
Thank you so much, and we appreciate that. We're going to turn to the subject of livability at this moment, and I want to welcome Suzanne Ishii, and she is the president of the Center of Creative Placemaking and the co-chair of the Together North Jersey Livable Task Force. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt. I am delighted to be here with you, and my co-chair, Kevin, is sitting right here in the front row of the Livable Task Force. I'm going to focus on the human element, and today I would like to focus on one word, and that word is diversity. When we use diversity as our watchword, I think that logically many of us, thank you so much, Courtney. I think that logically many of us go immediately to racial and socioeconomic diversity. Yes, we do recognize that, but in a broader sense, inclusive of racial and socioeconomic diversity, I invite us to look at governmental diversity, for example, diversity from our local wards to our municipalities, to our counties, to our state, even to our region. I invite us to look at diversity from the standpoint of diverse transportation modalities. I invite us to look at diversity from the standpoint of architectural styling and design of our commercial, our residential, and our public spaces. Because when we use diversity as our watchword, we are in turn automatically adopting inclusivity. which is critical for our individual communities and for our entire region. When we are inclusive, we are building communities of people who are engaged. When we are adopting diversity as our watchword, we can creatively use our engaged community members to identify existing assets and creatively look how we are going to utilize those assets most efficiently. And with regards to the most sustainability, with the greatest ROI, with the greatest return on investment for those assets that already exist, so that we are being financially responsible, and how we can utilize those assets to build and grow our own areas. When we use diversity as our watchword in our updating of our 2045 plan and in our communities, we are building communities that are sustainable and are communities that are focused on health and well-being. And we are doing that because we have an engaged citizenry who are looking at our asset pool beyond our physical assets, beyond our geographic assets, but to our cultural assets, our historical assets, our human capital assets. And we have these extraordinary opportunities within our own communities to identify those assets, for our engaged citizenry then to adopt stewardship of those assets, for our engaged citizens to take pride of those assets and to promote those assets. So when we talk about community building and engaged community building, we often use the word the fabric of our community. What is the fabric of our community? I, for one, have been a person who has actually been drawn to fabrics for my whole life. And I look at this in two different ways, just from an image standpoint. If you have a loosely woven fabric that is monochromatic and made of the same threads, that may be a fine accent piece for your fashion, if you will. But ultimately, it's going to start fraying, probably from the edges, and it's going to move away. But if you have a piece of fabric, I actually have a piece of fabric that was handed down to me, a garment that was handed down to me from my grandmother. It is a fascinating piece because it is woven of threads that are all different textures. Nubby, some of them, tightly spun together. They're all different hues and all different colors. And when I look at a small piece of it, I look at the tightness of that weave, of that fabric. And then when I look at it as a whole, I see a beautiful pattern that I can identify as a thing of beauty that has lasted for generations. So I leave you with that image of your community as a tightly woven, multi-hued, multicolored, multi-diverse community that will be a beacon for your immediate area as well as an identifiable area in your regions.
Thank you very much. I might add to that, by the way, that tight weave leads to strength.
And sustainability and durability. Yes, indeed.
Exactly. So I think that also leads us into our sort of final topic before we open up our question period, and that is the topic of resiliency and a resilient region. And I would ask you to welcome Linda Weber, who is the director of the Sustainable Jersey's Resiliency Program.
Thank you. So climate change. Temperatures are increasing at alarming rates. Sea level is rising. Extreme precipitation events are increasing, and severe storms are on the rise. It's grim news. We need to act quickly to protect our investments and make smart decisions moving forward, and ultimately to manage our infrastructure so that we remain regionally, nationally, and globally competitive. So to weather this storm of climate change, we need a new intentional and strategic approach to community planning and infrastructure management. And I would add the phrase that Mitchell Silver used, a culture change. is critical. So the Resiliency Task Force will be teasing out these new approaches and by compiling data and best practices, sharing information, identifying specific tasks to assist counties and communities, and also to inform the NJTPA work program. I just wanted to highlight a couple of themes that will be discussed in the Resiliency Task Force. The one is obviously climate science and uncertainty. The task force recognizes the need for communities and counties to better understand the climate science and projections and the tools and resources for mapping those projections. There's multiple mapping programs that are currently available here just in New Jersey, but the key is to understanding what programs are best for what jurisdictions, circumstances, and locations. Also unique to climate change is the uncertainty of what's to come. What hazard scenarios do we plan for, and how does the uncertainty factor into our long-term infrastructure planning and cost-benefit analysis? Extreme events and chronic stressors. I'm kind of rushing through so I get through the time, but identifying risks and vulnerabilities of physical, natural, and social systems is really the first critical step in resiliency. And we'll be looking at best practices and templates for conducting these assessments. There's a coastal vulnerability assessment that's currently being piloted in New Jersey by several organizations, including ours, Sustainable Jersey. We will be improving that tool as we continue to test it in the field. The task force is talking about the need for a similar type of assessment for riverine areas and to reflect the increase in projected precipitation. We also need to better understand the impacts of extreme heat for both transportation infrastructure as well as for public health. Natural resources also play a role in resiliency. And for one, we'll be looking at better ways to protect our natural resources because we know now more than ever before that they are actually play a role in climate change mitigation, whether we're talking about trees that mitigate the extreme heat, we're talking about wetlands that attenuate the wave energy at the water's edge. In fact, the Nature Conservancy just released a report 2 weeks ago that estimated the wetlands and marshes in New Jersey prevented over $425 million of damage, of property damage, during Hurricane Sandy. Natural resources also play a role in stormwater management by helping to minimize flooding as well as protecting water quality. And we'll be looking at best practices for green infrastructure for communities and counties. Greenhouse gases, transportation contributes to over 25% of total U.S. greenhouse emissions. This will continue to be an important role that we all play, from inventorying fleets to establishing and measuring emission reduction strategies. It's importantly not only for reduction of climate change to slow the rate, but also it's important to improve air quality, especially in our urban areas, as pollution and extreme heat are combined, will cause health problems and fall disproportionately on our vulnerable populations. So finally, we'll be exploring how we can translate these best practices and the work that we develop and the information that we share into guidelines and technical assistance for communities and counties, identifying tasks for others to pursue, and assist in pilot projects where possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I think what's also interesting is that as you talk the topic of resiliency and all the subjects that you're covering there, there's a direct correlation and tie-in between looking at those and the overall economic resiliency of this region. And actually, that's what all of these topics tie together for, and ultimately what is so critical for us as we look at the region as a whole.